This video actually started out in a very different direction. I was researching early 20th century fiction and its connection to Little Season eschatology. However, seeing everything laid out revealed a possible timeline for the events that explain who we are and where we come from. We have so much evidence with the mud floods, orphan trains, the Industrial Revolution, political revolutions, missing history, scripture, you name it. Others have touched on it, but I've always wanted to combine it all into one simple unified theory. Hopefully this snowballs into something bigger, and we finally reach a consensus. I've always been partial to the idea proposed by Malene from Leaving Babylon, Jason Jack, and others that the Little Season began in 1776. It's actually frightening being only a month away from the 250-year anniversary, and I hope it's much later. People definitely aren't ready yet, but it seems reasonable that it would be somewhere around this time. Just keep in mind that this isn't like my usual videos dealing with current events where there's a paper trail to the corruption. This is a completely speculative opinion based on a comprehensive list of what little historical evidence we have. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you already reached the same conclusion. It seems fairly obvious once you start looking into it. Feel free to dispute it, and if you have a better theory, definitely share it. Hopefully, all of us working together can figure this thing out. So, let's do this chronologically. There were two types of people during the Millennial Kingdom. First, we have the glorified saints, whose resurrected immortal bodies allowed them to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Well, actually forever. They were given everlasting life. This includes the Old Testament saints who were resurrected at the Second Coming, the church-age believers who were resurrected at the rapture, and the martyred tribulation believers who came to life and also reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. I believe this category of humans with glorified bodies to be giants as evidenced by the buildings they left behind. They do not seem to suffer everyday bodily functions and earthly temptations. Don't get too excited though, because they do not marry or reproduce, so we definitely don't descend from them. The rest were the mortal humans of the day and their offspring. Those who survived tribulation and gathered back to Israel, as well as the sheep from the sheep and goats judgment in Matthew 25:31-46. These mortal humans married, had children, and also died. Isaiah 65:20-2 shows that while things were certainly better, the sheep were still mortal, as were their offspring. You're probably thinking we descend from these people, possibly. But there's so much more evidence that has led me to think that while these descendants might exist on the earth today, they are not our ancestors, at least not for the bulk of us. I even considered the possibility that those of us who can trace our ancestry way back might descend from these people while most of us hit a wall around 1800. But the problem with this is that genetically we are mostly all the same, and Revelation doesn't mention the extended lifespans of the mortals reverting back at the end of the 1,000 years. That and some of the Ancestry.com data going back that far might be completely fabricated. While most mortals living under the reign of Christ were still good, just like all of their ancestors who survived tribulation and entered the millennial kingdom, there is a lot of evidence that many were wicked, as everyone has free will. So, it makes sense that some of them existed. Those are the ones Satan chose to manipulate and to do his bidding once loosed. The human heart is capable of rebellion unless transformed by God. They chose the path of instant gratification and were given top positions of power for this little season. Unfortunately, not much is written about the transition from the millennial kingdom to the little season, so we have to infer from what little information we have available. We do know those with glorified bodies went to the camp of the saints with Jesus. If they were still here, I think they would be fairly easy to spot. These mortal humans may have been mostly good, but the evil ones and their descendants are who I believe run all of man's institutions under the careful guidance of Satan today. When the glorified saints left and Satan was loosed, it's quite reasonable to assume he sought those who worshipped him during the millennial reign and proceeded to warp their minds to control them through their love of wealth and power to accomplish his goals. As we still see in today's leaders, they have been promised great riches, fame, and eternal life here on earth if they obey his wicked commands. And they actually believe his false prophecy. They readily admit it. In my first video, I referenced the Ring of Powers TV show. The second season is the best example I've seen describe the deception of Satan and how he wields it to power. Highly recommend any Christian who wishes to witness a first-hand experience to watch it. So, what happened to the good people? Well, evidence of the mudflat is everywhere and seems to coincide with the end of the millennial reign and the many worldwide revolutions happening at the same time. Don't really think I need to go into too much detail on that. I assume you're all familiar with this event. Now, Satan does not have supernatural abilities. He can't invoke fire from above or cause worldwide floods. So, how was everyone killed off? As we can see from historical evidence, population records, and mass graves under every city in Europe upon his loosing. While he may not have godlike abilities, he does possess the powers of manipulation and deception. It also makes sense that he would have the knowledge of other fallen angels like those who brought evil technologies to the people of Enoch's age. We've seen the pyramids. We know the Romans had the ability to level mountains. We know many ancient technologies far outpaced what we're able to accomplish even today. It makes sense that Satan trained and taught his early minions these ancient, wicked, and powerful techniques to wipe out the good people left over from the millennial reign. What isn't speculation is that the population of Europe was very low right before the start of the Industrial Revolution. Experts claim this die-off is partly due to the Little Ice Age that just ended prior to the population boom. They say food would have been difficult to grow in this perpetual winter. But of course, that's been debunked as they could only show that it occurred in the North Atlantic, not all of the world, not even all of Europe. And at worst, the average annual temperatures were only half a degree cooler, certainly not enough to have a dramatic effect on crops. Add to that the staggering number of mass graves all over Europe. This doesn't happen with natural deaths. Typically, people have friends and family who properly place their remains in tombs, crypts, sarcophaguses, burial plots, not dumped by the millions into plague pits and catacombs. History, shockingly, has little to no information on what happened, and what they do tell us doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. What we do know is that millions of people all died in a very short period of time, and when the recovery to reconstruct was underway, the bones were collected into massive holes in the ground. And in the case of the catacombs, in quite an organized fashion, the idea of Satan's minions doing the killing still makes sense regardless of the method. The Roman mountain leveling technology, runi montium, explains the mud flood theory very well. The idea is that you drill tunnels into mountains near a dammed water source. When that water is released, it collapses the mountain and sends dirt, rock, and water down to lower elevations, destroying the mountains and leaving a lake of mud across the area. Sound familiar? Parts of these cities are still being dug out to this day. Another possibility, although other methods we aren't even aware of could have been used depending on geography, is the old poisoning of the wells trick that has defined European history for centuries. Static in the Attic covered the book The Gods of Eden by William Branley in one of his videos earlier this year. It contains the testimonies of many towns, including the locals of Brandenburg, Germany, who witnessed 15 men dressed in black hooded cloaks, spraying the wheat fields with long tools. What soon followed was a local population dying of disease that caused its victims to be covered in boils. Bramley also shows us that this exact same thing had been reported all over Europe. Sometimes these long tools were used just to knock on the doors of people, and soon after they fell ill and died with boils. These men in black hooded cloaks and masks carrying long-handled tools is where we get the image of death, although he's typically portrayed with a sky. I guess that's what people from the era assumed this newfangled technology was, since they had no other frame of reference. Notice the gas masks reported by those throughout the history of European plagues. These people knew exactly what they were doing. The first biohazard suits. They even showed up in many towns and cities across Europe and posed as doctors. To no one's surprise, their patients got worse. Laws even had to be passed to prevent people of a certain religious persuasion from practicing medicine. There are virologists now admitting that viruses aren't even real. Even cancer research is proving that what they find in many tumors is parasites. Just look at the list of diseases that IM has shown to cure. It's parasites. It was always parasites, microscopic demons, and who has a long history of channeling demonic entities through sorcery. History shows us all these same tactics have been used in battle extensively. Chemical warfare has been around for a long time. These wicked people who survived the end of the millennial reign were given an education as soon as Satan was released from his chains and began recruiting them. So many Christians throughout history and right up through the present have been killed using these tactics. So, Satan had now killed off most of the people who weren't loyal to his reign. I say most because there is a possibility that many Christians survived the floods, poisonings, and were able to spread the word, which would help explain why we have Christianity today. Of course, the more likely explanation is that there were so many Bibles around that they couldn't destroy them all, and we found the teachings of Christ that way. And this makes the most sense to me because why else would the founding fathers have lifespans that more than double the typical person of the day? Is it because they descend from millennial reign mortals with extended lifespans? Think about the super wealthy or those in top positions of power today and their long lifespans, which may be even longer than we're told. So to create his dream society of technological advancement, money worship, and all-around debauchery, he needed a slave population. He rewarded those who served him in the beginning with positions of power and control, and their offspring still run the world today. It's no coincidence that some of the dumbest people alive are also the most powerful and have a strong lineage back to families with very dark histories, while most of us can't trace our family tree back more than 100 years. And this nepotism runs deep. These people who are involved in every type of satanic worship and occult ritual are obsessed with blood. They claim to descend from Shem and further down the line David and Charlemagne. King Charles actually claims to descend from Vlad the Impaler, which may actually be true depending on timeline. But we know that who they descend from are those that pledged their allegiance to Satan at the end of the millennial reign because they wanted control for a short, wicked while. And they were deceived into believing Satan's army, like the sands of the seas, could actually defeat the camp of the saints. I bet they're even more convinced now that they have control of advanced military weaponry. Either way, they're also obsessed with rituals. Doesn't matter if it's Jewish mysticism, occult, Freemasonry, whatever. It's all the same. And it's no coincidence that every president is related to each other, and that lineage goes back to European kings. And the European kings are also related to the banking families that go back just as far. The rest of us are just slave labor for them. Alpha Talks did a video about the rest of the dead and cited the book of Jasher about children being born in fields. Children were placed in the field and God said he would multiply them. They were reared by angels before being placed back in the homes of the original parents. Similar to Jesus' own loaves and fishes experience, God multiplied what was there. Gamers call it duping. Anyway, it showed imagery like Cabbage Patch Babies. And it's actually biblical, unless you don't consider Jasher biblical, but since it's referenced in Scripture, like Enoch, and we know who removed it, I call it inspired. Initially, I didn't think much of it. To be honest, it sounds very New Age, Mother Earth type stuff. But it got me thinking, if it's biblical, then maybe there's some truth to that. So I started digging into creating humans without sexual reproduction. And wouldn't you know it, there's a wealth of evidence. And to no one's surprise, it's a ritualistic part of every occultist satanic offshoot that you can think of. I'm not going to go into orphan trains, incubator babies, and Cabbage Patch Kids because it's already been covered to death. Except nobody that I've seen has done a deep dive onto who created them and why. If you know of anyone who has done research on this, let me know. On a side note, I do want to point out that the many pictures of babies in or on water, floating downstream, being birthed, so to speak, just more evidence for a birth certificate, lost ship at sea, fraud. But back on topic, they prove a point. We had a massive population boom of parentless children right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Historians just say, how lucky for wickedness. And it's fascinating to me that it's a mainstream narrative to discuss millions of children running around the US and Europe without parents. And yet they don't provide convincing evidence on how they got there in the first place. London, Paris, Moscow, Dublin, Vienna, you name it. Most European cities were stuffed with these children. The most popular explanation is just single mothers down on their luck, sending their children off to be raised by the establishment. Makes sense. You know how mothers never fight for their kids and parents rarely get their acts together once they do have a child? Give me a break. The idea is idiotic. Maybe a handful, yes, but for most children to be given up for adoption is a ridiculous idea. In fact, they weren't even given up for adoption because there weren't enough families to handle all these children. You had two classes. Let's start with the rich who cared for their own offspring. We know who these people were, the descendants of those who created the modern world under Satan's guidance. Then we have everyone else, broke slaves. They are unlikely to be descendants of the millennial kingdom because they are not only unaware of it and have no concept of who they are in the universe, but also because they have such drastically short lives. So where did they come from? Although this was true all over Europe, the US, and possibly elsewhere, the best documentation, whether real or forged, is from London in the late 1700s. They had these institutions called foundling hospitals and baby farms. These were massively successful businesses that dealt with orphan children, as they called them. The story goes that they took in babies and raised them up until the age of 5 or 6 before selling them to factories mostly. but also to do any type of labor, usually in the 10 to 12 hour a day range, but sometimes as much as 18. That's not employment. That's a level of slavery unimaginable. And it wasn't just locally. These kids were sold all over the world. And wouldn't you know it, the same wealthy people mentioned earlier already had a worldwide cattle slavery operation running at the same time. The infrastructure was already in place. But it wasn't just that they were sold into slavery at a young age. Most didn't even reach working age. The story is that 90% of them died in their first few years of life. It sounds like the most abusive puppy mill you can imagine. They literally didn't care if these kids lived or died because they could always make more. Not to say that humans weren't an important resource for them. Even today, you can look around and see they need us to pave their roads, invent new technologies, cook their meals, build their buildings, at least the ones they haven't appropriated from the millennial kingdom. You know, grunt work, make their lives easy. This is not only well documented in books by Charles Dickens, poems by William Blake, but also in the writings of supposed activists and legislation to handle these child assets. Entrepreneurs and philanthropists like Jonas Hanway and Robert Owen described cities and factories filled with children with no parents ever to be seen. It was like Neverland if Neverland was a slave labor camp. And it was a slave labor camp on a level we can barely comprehend today, even though we're still slaves ourselves. I kid you not, the good people fighting for these children's rights believed that they shouldn't start work until they were 10 years old. Yeah, they were the good ones. Where this narrative starts to lose me is when they start fabricating little anecdotes about it. It's like those obviously fictitious stories they try to make the narrative of people like George Washington and Isaac Newton appear real, but in reality they're exceptionally stupid and don't even make sense. Chopping down a cherry tree and not lying about it or coming up with world-changing scientific theories because an apple fell on their head are fables that most of us should feel insulted about. They don't even try. Well, there are a few of those regarding these stork babies as well. The first is that the mothers actually paid to give their children to these fouling hospitals to have them do the raising. They say it cost the mothers $5 each. 5 in the 1700s would have been enough to raise the kid yourself. It was the equivalent to a year's wages for a woman. If a mother has any hope, and 5 is a ton of hope, then she's going to keep the child most of the time. Could you imagine getting rid of your kid because you only had a year's salary in the bank? They also tell this romantic tale that the mother would leave a piece of cloth or a coin for future identification. Huh? How does that work? They had no record-keeping or logs of these kids. Even if they didn't, wouldn't you leave your name? I can't imagine how a piece of cloth or a coin is going to help a kid find their biological parents one day. It's beyond ridiculous and destroys all credibility. So where the heck did these babies come from? So wouldn't you know it, every single pagan, occultic, satanic, Freemasonic religion has some form of belief and ritual for resurrecting or creating life through sorcery. Surmising where we came from is almost too easy. They don't hide it, at least not very well. And although there may be a slight variation in their religious beliefs, they are all satanic at their core. Helena Blavatsky, famed 19th century Russian witch, occultist, Gnostic, and Freemason, wrote The Secret Doctrine in which she discussed various ancient human races, one of them being the Lemuran race or third root race, who were born of pods or eggs. She took her inspiration from many texts, one of which is the Oralinda book, which claimed to be a 3,000-year-old manual written by the Frisians, an ancient Germanic people according to this group. I only mention her because she's highly sought after in the occultic community. These books also speak of people being physically born of the earth. More New Age-sounding Mother Earth imagery, but both books mirror Jasher and imagery and have a huge following in the occult world even today. To be fair, we don't even have to leave canon since God created Adam out of dust. Definitely a similar theme across many of these works as all satanic offshoots derived from the original Jewish texts. Many of these books I mention are called forgeries by mainstream narrative and legitimate by many researchers, and the former may well be right. But since most of our history has been lost and replaced with very poorly developed stories, I'm inclined to believe that anything called a forgery simply fell through the cracks when they were trying to erase our past. The theme of creating life from non-living matter has been established in these Gnostic, Rosicrucian, Hermetic, occultic, Freemasonic, satanic texts. Let's be honest, they're all the same. They got their cue from the Old Testament, though, so let's dig into the application side of things. Paracelsus was a 16th century Swiss doctor and alchemist heralded today as the father of toxicology. He also had strong religious views that put him at odds with the Catholic Church, but he was admired by the Rosicrucian. Interesting. As you would suspect, his work is also highly regarded among occultists and mystics. Of course, he believed in a female deity, which is in keeping with the Mother Earth theme. He believed that science and religion should be connected, and he's right. You find God in the details of science. But like the Hermetics, he wanted to try and connect with his God through sorcery. In his book, Data Rom, he claims to have created homunculus or artificial men in the laboratory. And these weren't even the first test tube babies. Remember the legend of Faustus Jan George Faust, also a 16th century alchemist. He lived shortly before Paracelsus, and is known for making a deal with the devil, and among other things gaining the ability to create a homunculus in a lab. Is that the plural? Homunculus. Homunculuses. Homunculi. Anyway, Faust is clearly the inspiration for Paracelsus and all other alchemists. Alchemy being the scientific arm of the occult. We could also talk about the Mandriora homunculus here, alchemically created from dirt and body fluids, but Paracelsus says they're just misidentified homunculus. So it's all the same. So it's documented that we have Satan worshippers before the little season even ends, creating human life in the name of their master. And we know that even to this day, the occult still practices these dark arts. It's very reasonable to assume that this was the breeding ground or early testing stages for the creation of a slave labor force of humans with no prior knowledge of the past to make us easier to control. Once you break away from the Old Testament, you get to the true foundational documents of the Jewish faith, and they all believe in resurrection when their Messiah returns. Of course, Christians also believe in resurrection, but that's divine intervention. We don't engage in the practice ourselves. That's occultic witchcraft. The Zohar, or Kabbalah Jewish Mysticism Handbook, is where they start breaking away from the standard biblical resurrection. And don't think of this as some obscure religion. You know those red bracelets the powerful people from all walks of life wear. Yeah, they're Kabbalah, and it's everywhere. And it's easy to see why. There hasn't been a period of the little season so far where it hasn't benefited their earthly desires. And Kabbalah is where we actually see practical application. And although they don't go into specifics, they posit the LB bone, a small almond-shaped bone in the spine containing their souls, can be used in ceremonies to resurrect the dead. Named El after the immortal city of El, indestructible and inconquerable. I was not able to find the ritual description, but luckily we were able to confirm it is still practiced thanks to the tunnels discovered under the world headquarters of the CL in Brooklyn. I'm sure you all remember the stained mattresses, baby carriages, and other creepy stuff down there. David Saltzman describes their practices so casually in this interview from There Goes the Neighborhood that it almost scares me. David, if you could explain why was there a mattress in the tunnels, and what is this stain? A lot of folks are wondering, is this stain feces? No, it's not feces. Stain is blood. And basically, we did rituals. I said that before. There were some rituals that we do in the tunnels. And sometimes the rituals might involve someone who recently died, and we'll bring him down there, and we're trying to do a ritual to bring back the Messiah, which is a schneer sin. So can you explain the rituals, and why does it involve a mattress? I don't want to go to details of the rituals, but basically we don't put the body on the floor, we put the body on the mattress, and sometimes we might make an incision somewhere on the body and a little bit of blood will come out. So, yeah, no big deal. It's not feces, just the blood of the corpses we use to resurrect people. No doubt this is still a major part of their religion. You can do a quick internet search to find out about the golems. There are so many books on the topic, too many to name for sure, but quickly they are beings created by very spiritually evolved and educated rabbis. The Talmud even claims that Adam was originally created as a golem, so according to Jewish beliefs, only those who are close to God have the ability to summon these creatures. Rabbis have been claiming to animate life from inanimate matter using spells for centuries. They are described as being used for servant work. Surprise, surprise. Eleazar of Worms, a German Jewish rabbi and mystic, wrote the first known text that actually gives clear instructions for creating a golem, which involves the use of virgin soil, ritual cleansing, a verbal ritual, so a spell, and final activation through the use of Hebrew characters or names. Mosh Idol's book, Golem, appears to be the standard academic text on the history and nature of these creatures. It details the magic used to conjure them with the use of permutations. As we know, Kabbalah is a very numbers-based mystic religion. In fact, if you remove Satanism from most variations of the Jewish religion, you have nothing left. In his commentary on Sefri Yatzer, Rabbi Akiva wrote that you knead the virgin soil from the mountains with water to form a dough. Then you shape the body, head, and limbs like a life-size gingerbread man with a letter on each of them. Then it starts getting complicated. A general permutation is done for each limb of each letter of the Hebrew alphabet with every other letter into letter pairs. Then you combine each letter of the alphabet with each vowel sound. This just forms the golem's body. In the second stage, you must combine each letter of the alphabet with each letter of the tetragrammaton, their name for God, and pronounce each of the resulting letter pairs with every possible vowel sound. This is the activation spell process. Sounds crazy, right? But then why did they keep this practice for so many centuries if it didn't work? Let's break this down as simply as possible using the evidence at hand. Entire religions devoted to Satan who have run the world since the end of the millennial kingdom and still do today dedicated their efforts for centuries into creating life from non-living matter. Then most of the population dies and suddenly a new population appears out of nowhere with no legitimate explanation as to why. Seems they perfected the technology. This population was put into slave labor, which has evolved into the wage slaves that we are today, presumably as a way to keep us obedient so we don't revolt. Once they manufactured the slave labor force, the practice seems to have been lost and forgotten as their servants were and still are able to reproduce on their own. But they will soon be eliminating and replacing us with AI. This technology will do the same work but probably much more efficiently and without any of the headaches associated with humans like sprawl, waste, government brainwashing. We have to look at it from the perspective of the people who run the world. They are obsessed with AI. Every dollar possible has been diverted to this technology and they can't stop talking about it in the news or government. Even though the technology is not and might not ever get there, but it will be so much easier for them. We were the original AI. Humans created by a cultic ritual to be the slave labor for Satan's servants in this little season. But I don't think they're going to get to enjoy that life because the end is approaching faster than they can develop this technology. On the other hand, none of this ends until Satan chooses to march on the camp of the saints, which could be an army of AI soldiers long after we're gone. Just like all the fictional fantasies tell us, we are the creation of our own demise. We are building our replacements. So, I propose that we are the descendants of conjured beings. Regardless, we're still the descendants of slaves created by Satan worshippers one way or the other. And it makes a lot of sense why they see us as subhuman. The Talmud actually tells them that we are to be treated like animals. And from their perspective, it's easy to see why. God bless us all into these final days. May our spirits stay stronger than the ever-increasing temptations that surround us, issues that surround us, issues that surround us, issues that surround